Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. This morning we will discuss a book about humane education. Weil, the book's author, was one of the founders and is the current president of the International Institute for Humane Education in Surrey, Maine. The purpose of the Institute and of humane education more generally is to create a world where kindness, respect, and compassion are the guiding principles in our relationships with all people, animals, and the earth. Zoe now trains others to be humane educators through IIHE's graduate and certificate programs. Zoe received her master's degrees from Harvard Divinity School and the University of Pennsylvania. Zoe has been gracious enough to join me today to discuss her book, The Power and Promise of Humane Education. And I am Kurt Olson, a professor at the Massachusetts School of Law and your host for today's show. Thanks for joining us again, Zoe.
Oh, it's great to be back.
Thank you. The last time we met, we were discussing your first book, I believe, or one of your books, Above All, Be Kind. What's new in the power and promise of humane education?
Well, I wrote Above All, Be Kind primarily for parents, and the power and promise of humane education is written for educators, educational reformers, activists, people who want to teach and do humane education as opposed to raising humane children in their households.
I see. Okay, so there is a distinction, at least in that respect. What exactly is the International Institute for Humane Education, for those of our viewers who haven't heard of it before?
We train people to be humane educators, to do what I wrote about in my book. That is, to teach how we can live with respect and compassion for everybody, and to help children to learn how to solve problems and to be good critical thinkers and to make positive choices for themselves and for everybody whom their lives affect. So that's what humane education is, and we train people through basically 3 different ways. We have MEd degree program, Master of Education degree program, through an affiliation with Cambridge College, which is the first of its kind in the United States. And then we have a certificate program in humane education. And lastly, we have our 2-day weekend workshops called Sowing Seeds, which we bring throughout the United States and Canada in order to train teachers and activists and reformers to be humane educators.
I see, but the central location would be in Surrey, Maine,
Yep.
I guess in a beautiful location somewhere on the Maine coastline,
Yes.
near Acadia National Park, right?
That's right, we're right on the ocean. So sometimes people get to come to us, which is really nice for them, but a lot of times because we're so remote, we do travel around, and we are an international organization.
And how many people would you say that you've trained up to this point?
Probably we've trained close to 1,000 people to be humane educators. And then, of course, each one of those people who we've trained either through our workshops or through our degree program or certificate program, they're reaching many, many thousands of people through humane education.
I see. One thing that we discussed before is the fact that humane education reaches all people. But I had a conversation with you, I guess through email pretty much, in which I pointed out that I was listening to an NPR program where an individual called in. The show was about global warming. And he said, you know, I'd be a whole lot more receptive to the whole idea of global warming if it weren't these fringe types who are promoting the agenda of global warming. And he said, and what I mean by fringe types are these people who believe in animal rights. I can just never, you know, go along with anybody who promotes an animal rights agenda because I just don't believe in it. How do you reach someone like that, or can you?
Well, I think that there's a lot of media that portrays people who support the protection of animals in a certain way. But I also think that people across the political spectrum are concerned about what's happening to animals. For example, Matthew Scully, who was a Bush speechwriter, wrote a book called Dominion about our impact on animals, how we're harming animals. This is a very powerful, very important book. And it's written by a very conservative person who would hardly be called a fringe type. And I think that being kind and respectful and compassionate toward other people, toward other species, and toward the earth is something that crosses all boundaries and all political persuasions. And I think that, you know, maybe this person does not want to be reached, does not want to know about what's happening either in terms of global warming in the environment or in terms of animals. Maybe this person is more likely to just be swayed by media images. But I think that it's important for all of us not to be swayed by whatever images are out there, but to find out the truth of a subject for ourselves, because we're always going to see whatever issue portrayed in a negative light by somebody. And it's up to us to find out, is there validity? Should we treat animals respectfully? Should we protect the environment? Should we treat other people respectfully?
I see. Toward the end of your book, and I guess I'm sort of starting at the back and moving forward, but you discuss a number of different ways that different school systems can incorporate humane education into their curricula. How is it that you describe, I think you talk about 2-month periods during which they can address different subjects from humane education. Can you go over a few of those? Because I think it provides a helpful background for our viewers.
Sure. One of the things that I try to do in my book is make it possible for anybody to bring humane education into schools. So if somebody's a social studies teacher, they can incorporate humane education into social studies curriculum. If somebody's a math teacher, they can use real-life math problems that actually, if we figure them out, can come up with solutions to problems that are real problems, not just theoretical ones in a textbook. And in what you're describing, what I was trying to do was to come up with a sample syllabus, in a way, for somebody who wanted to do an elective course. Because, you know, all high schools have teachers who are excited to offer an elective course. Even though there are standards that they have to meet and there are tests that the students are going to be given, there are always opportunities for these sorts of things. So what I laid out was an elective course that could be taught over the course of the year that covered all aspects of humane education. So the first 2 months are on human rights issues. The next 2 months are on issues relating to media and culture and how we determine our values, the next 2 months on environmental issues, the next 2 months on animal protection, and then finally the last 2 months pulling it all together, because we do know that sometimes humans' rights and animal protection conflict, or environmental issues and human issues conflict. And when they conflict, how can we come up with solutions that are good for everybody, that are good for the environment and good for people, instead of thinking, as again the media often portrays things, in black and white or either or terms. Either we're going to protect the environment or we're going to lose jobs. That's often how things are portrayed. Or either we're going to help animals or people are going to die because we haven't done something to them. And those are not our only two options.
Right.
So humane education is designed to look at the complexity and interconnectedness of different issues so that we can come up with actually viable solutions that are good for everybody. That's the goal.
I see. And how would you come with a real world example? I believe I recently read a book by, it was published by the Trust for Public Land, and actually they were mentioning an area in Maine, very close to where you are probably, in which there's an individual who's lived pretty much in the woods off of the land for the last 20 or 30 years, and recently a golf course developer has moved into the area and said, okay, we're going to take these 20 acres or whatever it is and pretty much cut into the individual who's been there for so long. On the one hand, you know, you want to say, well, we want to support that person who's living off the land, but on the other, the golf course developer has his own dream about how he wants to use that land. How do you square those two and help those two come to some sort of a resolution that's good for both?
Well, of course, this is why we have a legal system, and of course you're a law professor.
Yes.
You know, we absolutely have conflicts that arise between different people and what they want to do, whether it's property rights or any other issue. And we know we live in a very litigious society, but I think that more people are trying to pursue mediation and conflict resolution as a way to solve problems.
Absolutely.
Because if we can solve problems on that scale, then maybe we can solve problems on a much bigger scale. For example, where we're confronting whether we're going to go to war or not. What are our other solutions? And often, instead of thinking about, okay, what do we need to know here? What needs to be solved here for this man and this golf course developer?
Right.
What needs to really happen here to come to some sort of resolution that is a compromise, or that actually, instead of being a compromise, takes us to another plane where we have a better solution. And it's just not the way we look at things. I don't know whether it's because human beings are inclined by our nature to think in black and white terms, or whether that's just how we've been taught. And so we fail to ask the question, okay, what are the solutions? So I don't have an answer to that, but what I'd do is I'd get the people together and we'd hash it out, and we'd come in with the goal of finding a good solution.
I see. Throughout your book, Power and Promise, you have a number of different exercises that educators can use to help students understand better what humane education is all about. And the one that I pulled out was the dying sperm whale that they found on a beach in North Carolina. And I believe there were a whole bunch of different, like, household items and things that obviously came from our culture inside this sperm whale. And, you know, another thing that happened to me recently was I saw this bumper sticker that says, you know, save the whales, collect the whole whole set. You know, on the one hand, you've got, obviously, I think your concern in humane education is, you know, let's protect the animals and find some way to better treat sperm whales, and on the other, you've got people who don't really seem to care. What was it that they found inside the sperm whale, and how do you use that to help instruct the students?
Well, what was found inside the whale was a whole variety of human detritus. There was milk jugs, there was trawl net float, there was rope, there were a lot of plastic items, there was a blob of rubber. I mean, all sorts of things were found inside the sperm whale. And when the autopsy was done, it was determined that this was the probable cause of death. So the way that we use this is we put the same sorts of items, obviously not the ones that were originally found in that sperm whale, but the same items, same kinds of items, into a big bag. And what I've done in schools is I go into the classroom and I stand on top of the teacher's desk, and I have the big bag, and I open it up and I let all the contents drop out on the floor. Well, you can imagine how that's received in the classroom.
Very dramatic, I imagine.
And then I invite the students to come up and take an item. And then we talk about, I tell them where the items came from, or that items just like them were found inside this whale, and we talk about what could have kept those items out of the ocean. What else could we have done with those items other than having them wind up as trash? How could they have originally been kept out if we don't need all of them? You know, what else could we have used, and what could we do with them now? You know, some could be recycled, some could be reused in obvious ways, like a rope. Some can be made into, you know, the milk jug could be made into a bird feeder or to a kind of lacrosse kind of game, you know, where you cut off part of it and throw a ball between it. I mean, there are things that we can do with it. Obviously, you can't do that with millions and millions of milk jugs, but what are the options that we have? So that's how it's used as a tool, and it's pretty much an icebreaker activity that leads into a much more in-depth discussion about what is happening in our oceans, because our oceans really are a dumping ground for all of our trash, all of our wastes, all of our pollutants.
Another thing that I found very effective in The Power and Promise is you tell the stories of a number of different humane educators. One in particular that comes to mind is Danny Denenberg, who I guess lives in San Diego, and she teaches humane education using a number of your techniques throughout San Diego County. Can you explain exactly what Danny's all about and what she does?
Well, Danny was actually our very first graduate of our Master of Education degree program, and she's now a humane educator in San Diego County, and she goes into schools and she does programs, and she's going to be teaching a humane education course next year in one school in particular. And one of the activities, the one that I described in the book, is another icebreaker, where she goes into the classroom and she has a name brand box for an athletic shoe, and she has a name brand wrapper for a chocolate bar, and she has a fast food container with all the different containers for fast food. And she invites students to come up one at a time, and so one student will open the box for the athletic shoe, and inside the box there's a piece of paper, and she asks the student to read it out loud, and what it says is, when you buy this item, in addition to getting a new pair of shoes and contributing to economic activity and growth and all of that, you may also be contributing to sweatshop labor and to animal suffering and to environmental problems. And so that's that box. And somebody else comes up to read about the wrapper for the candy bar. And so it's a chocolate bar, and it says, well, in addition to getting this delicious dessert, you are also contributing to world trade, but you may be contributing to slave labor, because slave children are actually gathering coffee beans in West Africa that wind up in our chocolate. So this is an icebreaker activity for her to then explore what are the different effects of our choices, and can we make choices that harm less than others? In other words, is there an athletic shoe that we can get that doesn't cause as much harm as one that's produced in a sweatshop, for example? Or if we are going to buy that one that's produced in a sweatshop, can we also write a letter to the CEO of the company and express our feelings about the wages and the conditions under which the people work? And with the chocolate bar, could we get a fair trade, organically grown chocolate bar, as opposed to the conventional chocolate bar, where we don't know if the cocoa beans were gathered by slave children? And the fast food, what are our options other than this unhealthy food in terms of our own health, in terms of the well-being of other species, in terms of the environment, in terms of communities of people and the people who work for those companies. So it's an icebreaker to really launch her students into a really important discussion about the effects of their individual choices.
I see. You also mentioned Melissa Feldman, who is another recent graduate, I guess, of the IAHE, who teaches in Boston now, and she also uses some illustrations to help students learn humane education. Can you explain some of those?
Sure, and Melissa actually did not graduate from our program. Melissa was once my boss. I worked with her at a Humane Society, and she was the director of education there, and we've been colleagues ever since, and she's here in Boston, and she is an independent humane educator, and she does programs in schools, and she does a fascinating program on advertising and consumerism, and she will go into a classroom and she'll be carrying a Tiffany's bag, and she'll say, if you saw me walking down the street, what would you think of me carrying this bag? And of course they have all sorts of thoughts. And then she pulls out a Victoria's Secret bag, and she says, now what about if I'm carrying this shopping bag? And then a whole different set of images. And lastly, she pulls out a Walmart bag. She says, okay, what would you think of me now? And then she asks them, well, where did you get this idea of me, just based on a bag I'm carrying? She'll also ask them to fill in the blanks. So she has a big sheet and it says got blank or just blank blank, and they fill it in. Got milk, just do it. And she asks them, how do you know about those things? And it all comes down to advertising. She's even gone so far as to pull out a Gap bag, and it doesn't have Gap written on it because she folds up where it says Gap, and she says, where is this from? And just by the color, they know it's from Gap. And so that launches her into a discussion about advertising. And what are the effects of advertising? And are we victims of it in the sense that we are no longer making conscious choices? We're only making choices that have been manipulated by advertising. So again, this is an opportunity for students to really uncover what is true and what is just presented to them, so that their beliefs are no longer molded just by what a corporation is spending lots of money to mold it in a certain way for. It's rather molded by their own ability to think critically. So, for example, Co-op America has said that Walmart and Target get an F and a D, respectively, in terms of their treatment of workers. So can we talk about that instead? Can we not just look at the advertising and not just look at the cheap prices, but actually talk about what the effects, again, of our choices are and not be so easily manipulated?
I guess I can see how it might be easier to instruct children on some of these issues, offering them choices and saying, on the one hand, you don't have to buy Adidas or Nike sneakers because those are made with sweatshop labor. But a lot of times the issue that is raised by parents that I speak to is, well, how do we do that and yet maintain the household? In other words, how do we not shop at Walmart or Target and still, pay the bills? I mean, what do you say to parents when the children come home and say, okay, we can't shop at Walmart anymore, Mom?
Right. Well, first of all, it's really important that humane educators never tell students what they should or shouldn't do. The idea of humane education is to enable students to think critically, to provide them with accurate information, and to inspire their respect and their reverence and their sense of responsibility so that they're able to make positive choices. So these should be family decisions. Often it's the other way. I mean, in my household, it's the other way. My son will want to get the Nike sneakers, and I'll be saying, well, can we find something different? But that's what he wants, because that's what his culture is asking of him, is to have these shoes. So then what are some other ways that we can work on these issues? Again, writing letters. So if the family can't afford to go anywhere but a big box store, then what's that family to do? It doesn't mean they don't have a voice anymore. They still can write letters. They can write an op-ed. They can write a letter to their editor of their local paper. They can contact Walmart. They can try and make change. I mean, corporations respond to the public. So we can influence corporations through our voice, even if we're not doing it through our dollars. So there are many different ways that we can affect change. And I think that the goal is to not think of ourselves as just victims, but as empowered people who have the ability to influence everything around us, not only through our choices, but through our voice.
You also bring up in the book a Freeman Wickland, I think his name is, from Minneapolis, I believe, and how he uses choice cards. We have a brief interval before the first break, but if you could just briefly describe what Freeman does and what choice cards are all about. Choice
cards are a way of ending a humane education lesson. As I was talking about before, there are components of humane education: providing information, teaching critical and creative thinking, instilling reverence, respect, and responsibility, and ultimately to provide choices. You don't want anybody to feel disempowered. So choices cards are just a simple way. A card is simply representing two different choices around an issue. So one card might say, bike ride, car ride. And the question is, which one harms less and helps more? Now, obviously, we can't always ride our bikes instead of driving cars in our culture. So then another choice card might say, hybrid car or conventional car. And then another choice card might say station wagon or SUV. That we have different choices all the time. Public transportation versus personal use of a car. Carpooling versus driving alone. So it's not as if any choice is presented as just an either or. There are many different choices cards. But that's an example of how they would be used, asking students which harms less, which helps more, so that students realize that there are choices out there that they could make.
I see. And now I think it's time for my choice, and that is to go to the first break. And when we come back, we'll continue the discussion with Zoe Weil and the power and promise of humane education. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you in a few minutes.
I'm still at the train station. I just almost got killed. Yeah, about 10 minutes ago. I'm still shaking. When I got off the 940 and Jill called. Yeah, it was raining, and so I put the newspaper over my head. I forgot my umbrella, and I didn't want to go walk over the overpass. And then I heard the whistle and the light. I was walking right into a train. This guy, he pulled me back.
Look, listen, and live, or someone you love will get hurt.
I just almost died.
Morgan! Phone! Yeah, Morgan here. Oh, hi. Right now? Okay. The eensy-weensy spider climbed up the water spout. Down came the rain and washed the spider out. Out came the sun and dried up all the rain. And the eensy-weensy spider climbed up the spout again.
I love you, Daddy.
I love you, sweetheart.
Family. Isn't it about time?
What can I say? It's my girl.
From the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
And we're back on Books of Our Time. We're here today with Zoe Weil discussing her book, The Power and Promise of Humane Education. And we were just talking about choices, but one thing that your book goes on to describe, I think it picks up from Above All Be Kind, the 4 different elements that make up humane education. Could you address those briefly so that our viewers know a little something about them?
Sure, yeah, I keep referring to them, but there's 4 specific elements that we've identified as critical to humane education. And the first one is providing accurate information about whatever whatever the issue is that you're teaching about. And that obviously seems obvious. Humane education is exploring all of the different things that are happening in our world that are mostly undercover, mostly things that we don't know about or learn about in schools or even in the media. So it's very important that that information be presented and be presented accurately. But that's not where humane education ends. The next step is thinking critically and creatively. So humane educators teach and instill critical and creative thinking. And it's really important that students not believe a humane educator any more than they would believe an ad. Students need to be critical thinkers around all of the information that's presented to them. The third element is the 3 R's, nurturing the 3 R's. And they're not reading, writing, and arithmetic. They're reverence, respect, and responsibility. Because these are the qualities that we need in order to ultimately make humane choices and come up with positive solutions. We need to have reverence for ourselves, for the earth, for other people, for other species. We need to show them respect, and ultimately we need to take responsibility for the ways in which our lives can help or diminish others, whether it's the environment or other people or other species. And then lastly, the fourth element is the one that makes the others meaningful at all, and that is providing positive choices. Now again, humane educators don't tell anybody what choices that they should make. But it's important that we know that there are choices out there, because otherwise, with all the information, whether it's about global warming or animal cruelty or human slavery, if we don't provide some positive choices, it can be very, very discouraging and disempowering and depressing to learn about terrible ills in the world without knowing that you can actually make a difference.
You actually quoted, I believe, from a book on human slavery, because I think a lot of people aren't really aware that that's still going on today as we speak. I mean, we think of it as something that's a 19th century phenomenon that's long past. But I mean, what is that book? And
the book is it's called Disposable People. It's by Kevin Bales. It came out in 2000, and I was as ignorant about the growing human slave trade as anybody. And when that book came out and I read it, I was shocked that this wasn't in the media. Now, it is in the media more. We've heard about slavery in the Sudan. We've heard about slavery in terms of cocoa plantations. But most people aren't really aware that there are an estimated 27 million slaves around the world.
I'd say they probably are not aware of that. I know I wasn't.
Yeah.
What is the term, the acronym SWABOT that you use in the book? And I guess that you've actually expanded on that in your humane education course. Can you explain how you've done that?
Sure. Well, SWABOT is a teacher's term, and it's an acronym that stands for Students Will Be Able To. So it's basically an acronym for teachers establishing objectives for their students. So a science teacher might have a SWABOT that students will be able to explain photosynthesis, and a language arts teacher might have a SWABOT, students will be able to break down the components of a sentence. For humane educators, I came up with SWABOT BEAK. Students will be able to be kind. That, in other words, in order to be kind, we need information, we need critical thinking skills, we need reverence, respect, and responsibility, and we need to make positive choices. That humane education, our objective is to enable students to put kindness into practice.
I see. And how do they do that in terms of animal cruelty? I mean, something that you bring up in the book is a 1980 article by, I believe, a Henry Spira that appeared in the New York Times, which I think sort of opened up the debate about the inhumane and cruel treatment of animals. I guess that's still going on at beauty products, treatment plants, and at home cleaning products, and those kinds of things. They're actually using animals and to do animal testing, which obviously is cruel to these animals. How did that open up the debate, that article?
Right. Well, Henry Spira was quite an activist. He worked on his own. He was not associated with an organization, and he was trying to always think up the really positive and exciting and innovative ways of sharing information with people. So he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, and it had a picture of a rabbit, and it said, "How many rabbits does Revlon blind for beauty's sake?" Well, this created quite an uproar because nobody, again, just like the slavery issue, nobody knew that rabbits had cosmetics dripped into their eyes and smeared on their shaved skin. Nobody knew about that or force-fed to them. And of course, this was about the eyes, which there was a test called the Drey's test. It still goes on today. And this raised public awareness, and consequent to this, there have been many, many, many companies which have discontinued animal testing because people were made aware and they used their voice. They used their boycotting power. So they bought the products that had the leaping bunny that said no animal testing, and they used their voice and they wrote letters and they sent back the products to companies like Revlon and all the different big name companies, Procter & Gamble, all of those that used animal testing. And some of them still do animal testing. Many of them have reduced animal testing, but many are animal testing free now. And it's thanks to people like Henry Spira who raised the issue, but then it's thanks to the rest of us who made different choices and expressed our opinions. Henry couldn't have done it on his own.
Right. It seems like it's had quite the cascading effect, because in the back of your book you offer probably 3 or 4 pages of those companies that don't do animal testing.
That's
right?
right. Yeah.
How is it that you instruct students to be able to think critically about advertisements so that they don't really just accept the message without thinking, well, is this really what this company is doing, or are they telling me something else?
Well, I'll bring in ads for students to look at, and there are a series of questions about the ads. And the first and most obvious one is, what is the product or service that the ad is selling? But then, that's the most basic question. But beyond that, there are all of the layers that we uncover. So the next question is, what deep need selling us products? In fact, one of the things that we do with some of our ads is we cover up the writing, and we ask students to guess, what is this ad selling? And most of the time they can't guess.
Right.
There'll be an ad for a woman and she's in the lotus position meditating. What's she selling? Well, it turns out she's selling clothes for Target. But how would you know?
Right.
And
one might think it's how to become a monk.
Yes, or how to become enlightened or reach nirvana or something. But of course, that doesn't necessarily sell any product. So we have to touch that need in somebody to sell a product. So once they uncover that, we'll also ask them, who's excluded by this ad? Ads are often appealing to people of a certain type, whether it's a certain race or it's a certain body type or it's a gender. So who's excluded by the ad? Another question we ask, and this is the crux of humane education, what suffering or cruelty or exploitation is hidden from view? So for example, if you're looking at a McDonald's or a Burger King ad, what suffering, cruelty, or exploitation is hidden from view? Well, all the factory farms producing the killing and producing the animals who go into those foods, and the monoculture crops that are, using genetically engineered crops now, and what that's doing to the environment, and all the pesticides that are sprayed that are getting into our waterways and polluting our waterways. Those are the things that are hidden from view when you look at an ad. And when students look at it critically, they begin to uncover that and unravel that. So again, the ads have less power over them.
I see. You also you brought up the example of how field trips can be very helpful to your students in terms of understanding things and thinking more critically about them. One of the ones in particular that I'm thinking of is the trip to the veal farm. And a reaction that I got after I actually read that passage to a friend of mine was, well, wouldn't parents take objection to that kind of thing? I mean, do they want their kids to actually see something like that? And my response was, I believe that in humane education, that those would be teenagers that would be going to see something like that, so it wouldn't be 8 or 9 or 10-year-olds.
No, not first graders.
Right. And how does that help them understand and gain a better understanding of what's happening to these animals to provide them with food? Well,
first of all, with that field trip too, all the parents had agreed that their children could go on this. This was not, it was not mandatory. I've taken students to a couple of factory farms. That is the intensive confinement operations that supply the vast majority of the meat in the United States. And we went to this veal factory, and the children, they were teenagers, they got to see for themselves the calves chained at the neck, in tiny stalls, separated from each other, unable to take more than 1 step forward or 1 step back. And that would be for the duration of their 4-month lives. And then, they'd never been able to walk since the day they were born, so on these atrophied limbs, they were then forced to get onto trucks to go off to slaughter. Now, they didn't see that, they just saw the calves. I also took them to see a typical egg factory and the battery cages that the chickens are in. And in a space maybe about this big, there were chickens, you know, there might have been 9 chickens crammed into a space that big on a wire floor that was sloped, so if they lay an egg, it would roll out and go off on a conveyor belt. And these chickens, they'd had their beaks sliced off with a hot blade so they wouldn't peck each other to death, so they had deformed beaks. Their bright red combs were pink and flopped over their faces. I mean, the conditions were ghastly. And the students got to see this for themselves. And I think it's really important that we see for ourselves, only in age-appropriate ways, whether we're seeing for ourselves how our food is raised or how garments are made, you know, going into the factories where people are sewing our shoes or our clothes. I think it's important that if we can, we see it for ourselves, because then we can make choices. And you know, there's a reason why it's so hard to see these things. I mean, it's next to impossible to get access to see a quote-unquote sweatshop. You're just not invited. And it was very difficult to gain access for these students to see these intensive confinement operating systems. And you know, one time I wanted to bring students to a slaughterhouse, high school students to a slaughterhouse, and nobody would let us in. And one person was quite upfront when he said they just wouldn't understand. I think that the fear is they'd understand all too well.
Right. Is it just the mistreatment of the animals, or it strikes me, and I think your book points out that one of the main toxins that's in chickens is something called Campylobacter.
Yeah, and Salmonella.
I mean, right, and I mean not only that, but in the case of factory farming, I guess the hog production in North Carolina, it presents all kinds of problems both to human health and to the animals themselves. Explain a little something about that and for our audience.
The environmental effects of this large-scale intensive animal agriculture is shocking. You know, these animals are producing an enormous amount of waste. In the case of the pigs, you know, these hog factories are producing lagoons of waste. In one case, it broke one day, the lagoon broke, and all that excrement went into the rivers, and thousands upon thousands of fish died, you know, within 24 hours. I mean, it's this kind of pollution that factory farming creates. I mean, factory farming, as far as I'm concerned, should be abolished for a host of reasons, for the human health hazards that are caused by all of these sick animals. And you know, factory farmed animals are routinely fed antibiotics and other drugs in order to keep them from dying during the tiny duration of their lives. I mean, they're very young animals when they're killed because we force them to be fattened so quickly. So it's bad for us. It's bad for the environment. It's horrible for the animals. So if people want to eat animals, then there are alternatives for them. They can buy animal foods that come from organically raised animals who are not in factory farms, or they can choose fewer animal foods and replace them with other foods, organic, plant-based foods.
Can you explain a little something about, I think you used Pedro the parrot as an example of how to instruct students on what it means to destroy the rainforest at the rate that we're destroying it. I guess the rainforest is one of the main sources of medicines and other helpful things for the human race, and yet we're destroying it at an unprecedented rate these days. How do you use Pedro, and can you explain a little something about the rainforest?
Sure, I love Pedro. You know, what I try to do in the book is offer different kinds of humane education activities for different ages. And Pedro comes to talk to young children, to elementary school students. And I describe how the teacher tells the students that Pedro's coming for a visit. And then when it's time for Pedro to come, the students are already all excited, and they all come outside to meet Pedro. And Pedro is a parrot, and he's actually a puppet. And the teacher's placed him in a tree. And so she goes and she puts her hand in Pedro, and Pedro greets the children, and he's so excited, and he asks them if they have fruits and nuts. And then he comes into the classroom and he tells the children about what's happening in his rainforests and what's the way they're being destroyed and what they can do to help the rainforests. So he gives them some positive solutions, because usually they ask, "How can we help you, Pedro?" And so it's just a simple way of sharing a very important and pressing issue that's really quite disturbing, but in a really positive way with young children. And in fact, young children are raising money to protect tracts of rainforest all over Central America, and you have children's rainforests. In Costa Rica, there's a cloud forest lots of acreage that's been protected by children raising money.
That's a difficult problem, really, to face, though. I mean, understandably, people from North America can send money to Central America and possibly someplace like Brazil, where I think the largest rainforest is. But I mean, those people have economic hardships that they face, right? I mean, and one of the main reasons they burn down the rainforest is so they can farm it and provide sustenance for their families. How do you deal with something like that's really a far-off problem?
Well, again, this goes back to that either-or thinking. And when those farmers are taught to use sustainable organic agriculture, they make more money, they produce more food, and in fact, when we raise the rainforests and cut them all down and burn them, what we wind up with is soil that doesn't last very long. So these farmers are forced to move and move and move again, and we've just destroyed the rainforest, we've destroyed ecosystems, and we haven't actually helped these people. There's a wonderful organization that's actually headquartered in Surrey, Maine, right near us, called Sustainable Harvest International, and they are going to Central America and teaching about how they can do sustainable organic farming, and it's helping people tremendously. So this is what I mean by finding positive solutions that help the rainforest and help the indigenous people.
I see. Thank you very much, Zoe. We'll be back in just a second after our next break, and we're here at Books of Our Time. We'll see you in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Welcome to a land of law, a place ruled by the dinosaur, where cactus-clad mountains spew lava and smoke, and craters hide inquisitive folk, where wise old turtles share their views on creatures with red vests and powder blue shoes. There's so much to Galapagos, so much we could say. 'Twould be most preposterous if it all went away.
What do you want to leave your children, the story or the place that inspired it? Since 1961, World Wildlife Fund has helped safeguard thousands of species like these, animals which can be found nowhere else on Earth. But in areas like the Galapagos Islands, we need your help to do more. Phone us at 1-800-CALL-WWF to find out about World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet campaign and about our free action kit, which includes information on what you can pledge to do to help leave our children a living planet.
We didn't have much to give then. The thin crop left us with hardly enough apples to fill the stand. So when they showed up firing them mean looks around the place and staring us down on prices, well, I was angry. Didn't seem to bother my father, though. He let them set a fair price. Too low, I thought. Then he did more. He had me load another bushel of apples in their trunk. I learned later on that this family was in need.
The greatest gift we give, it's in our heart, what we believe, the way we live.
Caring for others. Pass it on. A message from the Foundation for a Better Life.
And we're back on Books of Our Time, and today we're discussing the book, The Power and Promise of Humane Education, with Zoe Weil. When we last talked, Zoe, we were talking about sweatshop labor, and I brought up the fact that I don't think really a lot of our viewers really understand what the fair trade label is.
Right.
Can you explain what that means and what it means if they buy those kinds of products?
Basically, it means that the product was produced through living wages and fair working conditions for the person who produced it, or the people who produced it. So it's just a way of ensuring that you're not contributing to people being oppressed and exploited.
I see. How does that work from the standpoint, you mentioned before the break that that people have gone from Maine, the sustainable agriculture, and gone maybe to Central America or South America and explained to people how they can grow crops in a more organically friendly way. I heard a news item last night that in Afghanistan they're trying to get the farmers to give up opium growing and maybe start growing pomegranates. Well, my immediate reaction was, well, okay, you can make X amount of dollars from the growth of opium and far less money from the growth of pomegranates. I mean, is there any way to square those two things so that people can make a living?
I actually don't know that the actual farmers who are growing opium poppies are making that much money. You know, we know that the heroin that's sold at some point, someone's making a lot of money on it, but I doubt it's the farmers, frankly.
Right.
So, you know, if they were producing organic pomegranates, you know, we have pomegranate juice now touted as one of the healthiest things that people can drink. There could be a huge market. They could be making a lot of money. I don't know.
Right.
But I think that there are solutions to problems like that if we're looking for them.
Right. Okay. Something we talked about the last time we met is the MCAS, this emphasis on testing students. And something happened to me. I was trying to talk to a vice principal and about a student, and this vice principal said, "Well, I won't be able to talk to you for the next 2 days because we have the MCAS testing, and it's like, you know, the heavy stress because the state wants us to do this testing."
Right.
How can we both give students a little taste, at least, of humane education while, you know, meeting the standards of these horrible tests that they make students take?
Do you have an opinion about that?
Yes, I do.
It is challenging in this educational climate to add anything to the existing curriculum, simply because there is such a focus right now on standardized testing. That's going to change because, you know, we always go through different changes in educational reform. So I have no doubt that eventually that will change. The goal behind testing is a positive goal. It's to make sure that students know certain things, that they are actually proficient readers, that they can do math, that they can do the things that we need them to do to be citizens. So there is a good goal behind it. I think, unfortunately, the system is not working very well. Teachers are teaching to the test. We don't have critical thinkers. We have students who are trying to be able to solve multiple choice questions. And yet I know humane educators who have to do those tests. You know, they might be history teachers or social studies teachers. They still bring in all of these other issues. Their students become better writers, better critical thinkers, and ultimately they do as well, if not better, on those tests because they are better educated, ultimately.
Right.
So I think there's room for humane education. It takes a little creativity. And of course, we know that teachers are incredibly overworked and usually quite underpaid.
Right.
So it's a challenge, but most people who go into teaching do it for lofty goals.
Right.
So hopefully many of them will say, humane education is lofty enough that I'm going to figure it out.
Okay, and they actually, most teachers, it seems to me, are looking for creative approaches to solve some of their educational problems.
Yeah.
Can you describe another one of your exercises that you use? I think it's called the many colors approach.
Sure.
And you talked about how a humane educator used it to illustrate the problem of the northern spotted owl.
Yes. Okay, many colors. I created this activity basically to deal with this either-or thinking that we have in our culture. So you remember when the spotted owl was pitted against the loggers? And that's how it was presented in the media and by politicians, and you had the people who said, who cares about the spotted owl? We need jobs. And then you had the environmentalists saying, wait a minute, this is an endangered species. We have to protect this species. So that's how it was presented. So many colors, this is an activity in which the class is divided into 4 groups. In the case of loggers versus the spotted owl, you have one group to represent the loggers, one group to represent the spotted owl, or the environmentalists, one group to represent problem solvers. That is people who look at this situation and they try to solve the problem for both. And then the last group is the citizen choice makers, and they're the ones who have to implement the problem solvers' ideas through their own lives, through either disseminating the information or making personal choices. So what you can do this in a short way where you come up with, you know, the loggers can say their point of view, the environmentalists can say theirs, and the problem solvers try and listen to both and come up with ideas. Or you can do this as, you know, this could be a week-long, a 2-week-long, or even a term-long project where the loggers are really going to find out more information, really represent well the situation that the loggers face, and same with the environmentalists. And then the problem solvers have to spend a whole lot of time coming up with good solutions. and that the citizen choice makers can implement. The idea behind this is that you can use this for any issue that's presented in black and white terms. For example, whether we should have gone to war in Iraq in 2003. Imagine if we had actually, as a society, not been thinking in terms of either we go to war or we don't go to war, and it's going to be in April or March, you know, but we'd actually thought, okay, how can we solve this problem? What are some choices that we can make? And if we'd actually worked together thinking in that way, maybe we could have had a different outcome. I don't know.
Right.
But it's a different way of thinking, and that's what Many Colors tries to do.
I see. Another thing that you mentioned in the book, and I think this ties into the whole notion of advertising, is that a lot of school systems are stressed for cash these days, and as a result, they'll get corporations like McDonald's or Burger King or Coca-Cola or Pepsi or whatever to come in. And you bring up the Channel 1, which I think is supported by some of those corporations, but it doesn't really give students news. It gives them something else entirely. Can you explain what that is and how it harms people?
Channel 1 is a news program. It's 12 minutes long, 10 minutes are news, and 2 minutes are commercials. And this is a for-profit venture. It sells those commercials for $200,000 a pop. So this is a for-profit venture. It's making money for shareholders. It is not meant to be something that is truly educational. And so Channel 1 is in schools. The deal is that Channel 1 will provide TVs for all of the rooms and a central satellite dish to, you know, get the news program and broadcast it. And in exchange, the schools have to guarantee that on 90% of school days, 90% of the students watch Channel 1, including the commercials. So many people are very upset that their kids are spending this much time watching commercials in school. And some of those commercials are denigrating to teachers. You know, they depict teachers as, you know, buffoons and, you know, really out of date. And, you know, they're also commercials for things that are not healthy, you know, highly caffeinated soft drinks and candy. So some people, humane educators, are figuring out ways to use Channel 1 as a humane education tool so that the students are deconstructing and thinking about and analyzing what they're seeing. So they're looking for the hidden ads that are actually in the news program. So it's not just the commercials. There are also ads that might be placed behind, just like there's books behind us, there might be ads behind the newscasters who are teenagers.
So they're getting a subliminal message in addition to the one that's out front.
Yes.
Something else that you brought up that I thought was quite shocking in your book was walking into the school cafeteria and seeing posters on the wall. Some of them, I think, produced by the United States Department of Agriculture. One in particular that depicted a young basketball player dribbling the ball or shooting or whatever, and then surrounded by a pepperoni pizza, a Burger King, and a glass of whole milk. Why was that so shocking to you, and why do you not want to see it in a school cafeteria?
Well, the reason why it was so shocking was because of the words that were on the poster, which said, the Healthy School Lunch Program. And so yes, there was a cheeseburger, there was whole milk, there was a pepperoni pizza, none of which are particularly healthy as far as I'm concerned. But again, everybody should do their research to find that out for themselves. But if this is the Healthy School Lunch Program and that's what it's advertising, that's pretty shocking to me, because USDA is actually providing high-fat foods. It's a dumping ground for many farmers who can't get rid of their surplus high-fat foods, and it winds up in our school systems. And you know, we have epidemic obesity among kids, and they're eating foods that are extremely high in fat. You know, one study looked at the foods that are served in schools, and it was 40% of calories from fat, which is 10% higher than what the highest recommendation is, which is no more than 30% of our calories should be from fat.
Does that mean that I think that the USDA recently came up with a new food pyramid, and it explains, you know, how much of each food you're supposed to eat on a daily basis for good health. Can we really believe what the USDA says in their food pyramid, or is that something, again, we have to do our own investigation and make sure that they're telling us the truth? Well,
critical thinking comes in handy even with our government, and I believe that's true of the USDA food pyramid. Nutrition is one of those things people are going to argue endlessly about. You know, the fact is that in a Whopper with cheese, a kid is getting 200% of their daily allowance of saturated fat. That can't be good for us. You know, originally the food groups, there were 12 of them when they originally designed them, but there was so much pressure from the meat and dairy industry that they got their products to be 2 of the now whittled down to 4 food groups. So again, it's really important to take this all with a grain of salt. Find out where the nutrition information is coming from. You know, our government has a mandate, obviously, USDA has a mandate for promoting healthy foods, but they also have a mandate to promote the sale of certain foods, and meat and dairy products in particular. So, you know, if USDA were working for the broccoli and potato groups, you know, we'd have to suspect that as well. I think it's really important to just find out for ourselves and read unbiased sources.
I see. Can you explain a little something about the Council of All Beings? I think that's a very helpful exercise, and I think in your book you described Mike, who you didn't think would be very receptive to the idea of humane education, but then turned out to be, I guess, one of the better examples of how somebody can learn through the process.
Yes. Well, the Council of All Beings is an activity I often will do at the very end of a course, a humane education course. And in it, the students have the opportunity to actually become, in their imaginations, either another human or a plant or a landscape or an animal, and to speak for that other being. And when I say speak, I mean actually say what's happening to them. What wisdom do they have? What would they like to teach humans? There's a book called Toward a Council of All Beings, and it describes this at length. And so I had been teaching this course, and there was this boy in the class. He was very bright. He was a senior. He was on his way to an Ivy League college, and he never seemed to be connected to the material. And he listened intently, but never cracked a smile, never expressed empathy. And we were learning about some pretty rough stuff. And we did the Council of All Beings. And when he spoke, he became the ocean, and poetry just came out of his mouth when he spoke. And it was so moving. And at the very end of the council, which was the very last day, I was going to be with these kids, and he was going off to graduate. And he said, when I look back on high school, this is what I'm going to remember. And I realized you never know when you're having an effect.
Right, so it's not Paul Simon's song that's running through his head about high school, it's humane education.
Let's hope.
You also bring up the notion of the behind the scenes, and I think I was actually going to bring out a bottle of Coke as an example, but unfortunately I failed to do that. Can you explain a little something about how behind the scenes works?
Sure. This is another activity where we look at a product and we try to find out all of the things that go into that product. All the ways humans are affected, the environment's affected, animals are affected, other people in other societies are affected. So we actually look at the product and we look at all the effects. So with a can of Coke, you could look at the aluminum production, the bauxite mining, you could look at where the plant is located. You know, for example, Coca-Cola has opened a plant in India and is depleting water sources so that people aren't in that community can't get fresh water. You know, there's a statistic in the book about how we drink more sodas than tap water, or well water for that matter.
Right.
So what are those effects? What are the effects of the paint that's used on the aluminum? What are the effects of the product itself on our health? What are the effects of shipping this fairly heavy product? You know, liquids are pretty heavy and we're shipping them. There's a lot of fossil fuel use that goes into it. There's refrigeration for all of those vending machines. What are all the behind the scenes effects? You know, one interesting statistic, this comes from All Consuming Passion, which is a little booklet that people can get from the New Roadmap Foundation. And one statistic really surprised me. I mean, it's an obvious one, but I'll share it. And that is that in a can of diet soda, a 12-ounce can of diet soda, that can represents 2,200 calories of energy going into its production. And it produces 1 calorie of food energy for the person who's consuming it in a can of diet soda.
So it doesn't seem like the trade-off is really fair.
Yeah.
You include at the back of the book, My Life is My Message, the questionnaire. First of all, where did that come from? And I believe you quoted Mr. Channing. And I was wondering how we can all use the My Life is My Message questionnaire to better understand humane education and become more humane people.
Sure. Before I do, I want to say one more thing, though, about the Coke or the product.
Yes.
And that is that humane education isn't against buying things. It's inviting people to buy things consciously. So instead of the can of Coke, what else might you have? So it's not a Luddite philosophy of, oh, we're going to just deprive ourselves. It's trying to be aware of our choices so we can make better choices. So to get to the My Life is My Message questionnaire, Mahatma Gandhi was once asked by a reporter, what is your message? Well, he could have gone on and on, right?
Right.
He answered very simply, my life is my message. And so I created a questionnaire in the back of my book so that everybody who does that questionnaire can really examine whether their life is their message. Because in fact, as humane educators, nothing that we say is going to matter nearly as much as who we are and what we do. And that brings up William Channing, I'm blanking on his name. You just
Ellery,
asked me.
I think, Channing Ellery.
Yes.
Right.
And what he said, he was a Unitarian minister, and he was here from Massachusetts. And he said, "May your life preach more loudly than your words."
And on that note, Zoe Weil, thank you for joining us again today. The book is Power and Promise of Humane Education, and I'm Kurt Olson. Thank you for joining us on Books of Our Time.